She had $11 left in the world, a dog with one torn ear, and a piece of paper the auctioneer laughed at when he sold it to her. The land was called Widow's Table, by the men who'd tried to farm it and failed. 90 acres of cracked red rock, where nothing grew taller than sage, where the wind never stopped, and where, folks in Larkspur said, even the jackrabbits knew better than to stay. She bought it anyway, because it was the only parcel left that anyone would sell to a woman alone, and because the bank that had taken her husband's ranch 6 weeks before was the same bank auctioning it off. When she signed her name, Eleanor Hargrove, widow, 34 years old, the clerk didn't bother hiding his smile. The town had already decided what she was: a fool. A woman too proud to go back east, too stubborn to remarry, throwing her last coin at a patch of ground the desert itself had rejected. Only her dog, a rust-colored shepherd mix named Copper, sat close against her skirts, and did not look away from her, not once, the whole ride out. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Hargrove and her faithful dog Copper. If you've ever been counted out before you'd even had the chance to try, if you've ever found something worth keeping in a place everyone else called worthless, stay with us, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The trouble had started the way trouble usually does in cattle country, slow and then all at once. Eleanor's husband, Thomas, had built the Hargrove spread up from nothing, 40 head of longhorn, and a stubborn belief that the land west of Larkspur would someday be worth something to somebody besides jackrabbits and coyotes. For 9 years it had been enough. They'd had a good house, with a stone chimney Thomas laid himself, a well that never ran dry even in August, and between them, a kind of quiet understanding that didn't need many words. Copper had come to them as a pup, the runt of a litter born in their barn, to a stray who'd wandered in one winter and never left. Thomas had named him for the color of him, bright as a new penny in the sun, and the dog had grown up trailing Eleanor's heels through every chore of every day until the two of them moved like a single creature with two shadows. Eleanor remembered those years the way a person remembers weather, not as a single memory, but as a texture, a season that repeated itself gently for nearly a decade. Mornings smelled of wood smoke and the tallow she rendered for soap. Evenings smelled of horses and turned earth, and underneath it all, the dry sage scent that never left a person's clothes no matter how often they were washed. Thomas used to say a ranch wife learned twice the trades of a ranch husband, and Eleanor had learned them all: how to set a bone, how to read a sky for hail before the clouds had fully gathered, how to keep a fire low and patient through a night so cold the well pump froze solid by morning. She had never once, in 9 years, doubted that the life she'd chosen was a hard one worth choosing. It was only afterward, in the wreckage of it, that she began to wonder whether hard work alone had ever been enough to keep anyone safe from men who kept their ledgers closer than their promises. Copper grew alongside all of it, gangly and copper bright, learning the rhythms of the ranch the way children learn a language, simply by living inside it. He learned to bring the milk cow in from the far pasture without being told twice. He learned which of Thomas's boots meant a long ride, and which meant only a walk to the barn, and adjusted his own eagerness accordingly. And he learned, most of all, to watch Eleanor. Not with the blind devotion people sometimes assign to dogs and stories, but with something that felt, even to her, more like partnership. When she was troubled, he pressed against her leg before she'd said a word about it. When she laughed, truly laughed, he'd bark once, sharp and pleased, as if he'd been the one to earn it. Thomas used to tease that the dog understood her better than he did, and Eleanor, more often than not, hadn't been able to argue. Then came the drought of '87, and after it the winter that killed a third of the herd, and after that the banknotes Thomas had signed to see them through, notes he never showed Eleanor until the collector came knocking with papers she didn't understand and a smile she understood too well. Thomas rode out in a February storm, to bring in what stock they had left, chasing 3 strays into a canyon that had claimed better riders than him, and he did not ride back. Copper found him 3 days later, half buried in a drift, and it was the dog's howling that brought the search party at all. Eleanor buried her husband on a hillside, with a view of the mountains he'd loved, and 4 months after that, the bank, the very same institution Thomas had trusted with his signature, foreclosed on everything else: the house with the stone chimney, the well that never ran dry, 40 head of longhorn, sold at auction for less than they were worth to a rancher named Silas Pruitt, who happened to sit on the bank's board and happened, too, to have wanted the Hargrove water rights for 11 years. Eleanor did not cry in front of the town. She had learned, in 9 years of frontier life, that grief shown in public was grief other people felt entitled to comment on, and she had no patience left for commentary. She packed what little the bank hadn't claimed: a trunk of clothes, her mother's Bible, a rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot straighter than most men in the county, and copper, who would not be left behind no matter how many times the bank's men shooed him off, and she found a room above the Mercantile in Larkspur, while she decided what a woman with almost nothing was supposed to do next. She took in mending, she sold what jewelry she had, and every week she watched the numbers in her tin box grow smaller instead of larger, until the morning she woke up and understood, with the particular clarity that only real desperation provides, that she had exactly enough left for one decision, and that decision had better be made with her eyes open. The months in that narrow room above the Mercantile taught her a different kind of endurance than the ranch ever had. There, at least, the hardship had purpose: a fence to mend, a calf to pull, a fire to build against a coming storm. In town, the hardship had only waiting attached to it, and waiting, Eleanor came to understand, could wear a person down in ways that honest labor never had. She listened through the thin floorboards to the Mercantile's customers below, and more than once heard her own name spoken in the particular hushed tone reserved for cautionary tales. Poor Eleanor Hargrove, lost the ranch, lost the husband first, and then the ranch, as though the two griefs were interchangeable, as though either one alone might have been survivable but together they'd proven too much. She never corrected anyone. She simply kept her chin level, and her stitches even, and every night she brushed the dust from Copper's coat by lamplight, and told him, in a voice too quiet for the floorboards to carry, that they would find their own way through it, whatever that way turned out to be. He always thumped his tail once against the floor, as though he'd already decided to agree with her before she'd finished the sentence. The county auction posted 3 parcels that spring. 2 were fine grazing land near the river, snapped up before she'd even finished reading the notice, bought by men with names the bank liked. The third was Widow's Table, 90 acres of red rock so poor that even squatters wouldn't claim it, land the county practically wanted to give away just to stop paying taxes on it. $11. Eleanor had $11.40, and when the auctioneer called the parcel, and no one else raised a hand, she raised hers, and the laughter that went through the small crowd gathered outside the courthouse was not unkind exactly, but it wasn't kind either. She heard the word fool more than once as she signed the deed. She heard someone say she'd have been smarter to keep the $11 and buy a train ticket east. She said nothing back. She had learned that too, since Thomas died, that silence cost you nothing, and words spent on people who'd already made up their minds about you were words wasted. It was Copper who noticed something was different about Widow's Table before Eleanor had even climbed down from the wagon seat. As the mule pulled them over the last rise, the dog's ears came up sharp and forward, and a low sound rolled out of his chest, not quite a growl, more the sound a dog makes when it recognizes something before it understands what it's recognizing. Eleanor set the brake, and looked out over the land she now owned, flat red rock, stretching toward a line of low hills, scattered sage, a dry wash cutting through the middle of it like an old scar, and saw nothing worth the sound Copper was making. But she had learned, over the years, to trust that sound. Thomas always said the dog knew things before people did. She just didn't yet understand what there was, on 90 acres of rock, for a dog to know. We won't ask you to wait long for the answer, but we do want you to understand, before we go on, exactly how much this woman had already survived to get here. Because everything that came next would test her all over again, and it's easier to understand courage when you've seen what it costs. The first days on Widow's Table were about survival more than mystery. Eleanor pitched a canvas tent near the dry wash, where at least there was shade from a stand of stunted cottonwoods, and she set about the business of proving to herself, if no one else, that she hadn't wasted her $11 entirely. She dug for water, and found none worth the effort. She walked the property twice over, boot heels ringing on rock that hadn't held a plow in living memory, and she began to understand why the men before her had failed and left. It was Copper's behavior, more than anything, that kept her from despairing entirely. Every evening, without fail, the dog would trot to the same low rise at the western edge of the property, stand with his nose lifted into the wind, and refuse to come when called, until Eleanor herself walked out to fetch him. The first night, she thought it was simple curiosity. By the fourth night, she'd begun to wonder. He would stand there long after the light had gone violet, and then gray, ears pricked towards something Eleanor could neither see nor hear, and once, on the third evening, he let out a single low whine, so full of longing, that it raised the hair on her arms before she even understood why. It was not the sound of a dog chasing a rabbit's scent. It was closer, she thought uneasily, to the sound he made outside a door he knew held something important on the other side of it, and there was no door anywhere on Widow's table, only rock, and sage, and 90 years of silence waiting to be disturbed. What none of them knew yet, not Eleanor, not the dog whose nose had already begun to make sense of what his eyes could not, was that the answer waiting beneath that western rise would soon draw the attention of a man far more dangerous than any drought or any winter Eleanor had already survived. On the fifth morning, a dust storm rolled through ahead of a spring rain, the kind of blow that stripped soil down to bedrock and left the land looking different than it had the day before. When it passed, Eleanor walked the western rise to check on her small camp, and found Copper already there, digging. Not the aimless scratching of a bored animal, but a focused, determined effort, both front paws working in a rhythm, dirt flying between his back legs, a whine building in his throat that she recognized from exactly one other time in his life, the winter he'd found Thomas in the snow. Her stomach turned cold at the memory, and she ran the last 30 yards calling his name, terrified of what a dog who dug like that might have found. What Copper had found was not a body. It was a wheel, an iron-rimmed wagon wheel, half swallowed by 90 years of blown red dust, its wood gone silver-gray and cracked but its iron band still holding true. Eleanor knelt beside it, running her fingers over metal gone rough with rust, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in months. Curiosity, plain and simple, uncomplicated by grief. Copper would not leave the spot. He paced a tight circle around the buried wheel, whining low, then sat directly beside it, and looked at Eleanor with an expression she could only call expectant, as though he'd done his part, and now it was hers to finish. It took her 3 more days of careful digging, working before dawn and after dusk, to spare herself the worst of the sun, to understand what she'd actually bought when she bought Widow's table. Beneath the dust and the sage roots and 90 years of desert weather lay the remains of an entire wagon train, 6 wagons in all, that she could eventually count, sunk into the earth in a rough line as though they'd been abandoned mid-journey and simply left to be swallowed by the ground. The wood of the wagon beds had mostly rotted away, but the iron fittings remained. Brake bands gone to lace-thin rust, ox yoke rings still holding the shape of the animals long dead, a single tin cup wedged beneath a collapsed floorboard, as though someone had set it down mid-meal and never returned to finish. Eleanor worked with a garden trowel in her bare hands, and every inch of ground she cleared seemed to answer some new question with 3 new ones. Who had left 6 wagons in a line, rather than scattered by panic or attack? Why had nothing been looted in 90 years, out here where drifters and raiders alike had surely passed through at one time or another? And why, of all 6 wrecks half swallowed by the desert, did Copper return again and again to the second wagon, digging at its ruined floor with a single-minded urgency he showed toward nothing else on the property? The smell of it stayed with her longest, she would say later, not decay, for there was little enough left to decay, but the dry mineral smell of old iron and older pine, a smell that seemed to rise up out of the ground itself the deeper she dug, as though the desert had been holding its breath for 90 years, and was only now, reluctantly, letting it go. Inside the wreck of the second wagon, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, and protected just enough from the worst of the weather by a lucky fold of collapsed canvas, Eleanor found a strongbox, its lock long since rusted solid, and beside it, a leather satchel that Copper would not stop pawing at, gently, almost tenderly, as though he understood it mattered before she'd even opened it. He lay down finally, with his chin resting directly on the satchel's edge, guarding it, the way he might have guarded a sleeping child, and did not move again, until Eleanor had carefully worked the buckle loose herself. That satchel held papers, water-stained, yellowed, some illegible, but enough survived to tell a story 90 years old, a story that would, in time, mean far more to Larkspur than any strongbox of coin ever could, though Eleanor did not know that yet, kneeling in the dust, with her dog pressed warm against her side, and the whole desert gone quiet around them, as if it too were holding its breath. We promised you a bigger revelation was coming, and it was. But what Eleanor found in that satchel was only the beginning of understanding what those wagons had really been carrying, and why someone, 90 years ago, had gone to such trouble to see them lost. The papers, once Eleanor had dried them carefully in the shade and puzzled through faded ink with the patience of a woman who had nothing left to lose by trying, told the story of an 1821 trading expedition, 6 wagons out of St. Louis, bound for a Spanish land grant, carrying not just goods for trade, but the original grant documents themselves. Along with a strong box of gold coin, meant to establish a settlements bank and secure water rights along the very river that ran, still, along the eastern edge of what was now Larkspur County. The expedition's leader, a man named Josiah Kerr, had never arrived. History, what little of it Eleanor could piece together from a torn journal folded inside an oilskin wallet, remembered the Kerr expedition only as a rumor, a caravan that vanished into the frontier, and was presumed lost to weather or raiders or its own bad luck, its cargo written off, its story forgotten by everyone except, perhaps, the family that had waited for a return that never came. But the deepest documents in the satchel, the ones that made Eleanor's hands go still when she finally understood their meaning, were not about gold at all. They were survey grants and water rights, original and notarized, establishing that the river bordering what was now Larkspur, the very water that fed half the ranches in the county, the water Silas Pruitt had spent 11 years trying to fully control, had been granted, 90 years prior, to the settlement Kerr's expedition was meant to found, with usage rights that, by the strange and stubborn logic of frontier law, might well still apply to whoever now held that original grant. Eleanor did not fully understand the law of it, but she understood enough to know that what she'd bought for $11 was not worthless rock, it was a 100-year-old key to water that an entire county depended on, and the man who currently believed he controlled that water was the same man who'd bought her husband's ranch out from under her. She might have kept it quiet. She thought about it, that first night, sitting by her small fire with the satchel wrapped safe in oilcloth beside her, and Copper's head heavy and warm across her knees. She could take the gold, what there was of it, and go east, and never think of Larkspur or Silas Pruitt, or the bank that had ruined her again. It would have been the easy thing. It would also, she realized, watching Copper's ears twitch even in sleep, alert even now to some sound she couldn't hear, have been a betrayal of every rancher in the county who was paying Pruitt's water rates because they had no other choice, the same way she'd once had no other choice but to sign a banknote she didn't fully understand. She thought of Thomas. She thought of what he would have wanted done with something this size, this consequential, landed in the hands of a woman the whole town had called a fool. And somewhere in that long night, watching her dog sleep with one ear still cocked toward the dark, Eleanor Hargrove decided she was not going to run. The trouble, of course, was that Widow's Table did not stay quiet for long. A woman digging alone at the edge of town draws talk, and talk in a place like Larkspur traveled faster than any telegraph. Within a week, riders had come out twice under thin pretexts to look over the fence line at what Eleanor was doing, and by the second week, Silas Pruitt himself rode out, dressed too well for the dust, smiling too easily for a man with no real business there. He offered to buy the parcel back from her, generously, he said, twice what she'd paid, and when Eleanor declined, politely but without hesitation, his smile thinned into something colder, and he said, in the mild voice of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted eventually, that Widow's Table was poor land for a woman alone to hold on to through a hard winter. It was not quite a threat, it did not need to be. Copper, who had lain quiet through the whole exchange, rose slowly to his feet, and placed himself, without being asked, squarely between Eleanor and Pruitt's horse, a low growl rumbling in his chest, until the rancher turned his mount and rode away. Something is coming for Eleanor now that all the gold in that strongbox never could have prepared her for, and it will take everything she's learned about quiet strength, and every ounce of loyalty her dog has to give, to see it through. Silas Pruitt did not wait long to act, because men like Pruitt rarely do once they understand what's truly at stake. Within days, word reached Eleanor, carried, ironically, by the same mercantile owner who'd once laughed at her purchase. that Pruitt was quietly buying up the debts of half the ranchers along the river, calling in notes before their time, using the bank's own leverage the way he'd used it against the Hargrove spread years before. If the old water grant Eleanor now held proved valid, Pruitt intended to make certain there would be no ranchers left independent enough to benefit from it, only debtors so deep in his pocket that whatever rights the courts eventually recognized would belong, in practice, to him alone. It was a plan built on the same cold arithmetic that had widowed Eleanor in the first place, and understanding it lit something in her that grief alone never had: a clean, steady anger, the kind that does not burn out but settles in and gets to work. What made it personal, in the end, was not only the water. It was the particular cruelty of learning, from a rancher's wife who'd once brought Eleanor a casserole after Thomas's funeral, that Pruitt had known about the old Spanish grant for years, that a surveyor working for his bank had turned up rumors of it a full decade before Eleanor ever set foot on Widow's Table, and that Pruitt had quietly petitioned the county to have the parcel classified as worthless and struck from any serious sale, hoping to buy it himself once the fuss died down and the price had dropped low enough to draw no attention. He had simply never expected anyone foolish enough, or desperate enough, to outbid his patience. Eleanor sat with that knowledge a long while, turning it over the way she'd once turned over Thomas's unpaid notes, and understood at last that she had not stumbled into Pruitt's plans by accident. She had backed into the one parcel in the county he'd never quite managed to steal for himself, and he intended to correct that oversight by whatever means were left to him. She rode into Larkspur with the surviving documents wrapped carefully in oilcloth and laid the whole story before the county judge, a tired, honest man named Alistair Dunn, who had watched Pruitt's rise with more unease than he'd ever had cause to say aloud. The papers were old, water-damaged, and their legal standing uncertain enough that Dunn could not simply rule on the spot, but they were real, and notarized, and enough to force a hearing, which was more than Eleanor had dared to hope for a week before. Pruitt, informed of the hearing, did not take the news calmly. He sent men out to Widow's Table twice more, first with another offer, higher and more urgent than the last, and when Eleanor refused a second time, with something closer to intimidation, riders who trampled her small garden plot, who left her well fouled with dead brush, who made certain she understood, without ever saying so outright, how alone a woman could be made to feel on 90 acres, at the edge of a county that mostly still thought her a fool. It was Copper who caught the third attempt before it could become something worse. 2 nights before the hearing, with the original grant papers locked in Eleanor's small tent for safekeeping, the dog woke her in the deep hours before dawn with a bark unlike any she'd heard from him before, sharp and continuous, and utterly without fear, driving off 2 men who'd come to take the satchel by force and make the whole matter disappear before it ever reached Judge Dunn's bench. Eleanor came awake with Thomas's rifle already in her hands, years of frontier caution moving her body before her mind had fully caught up, and between the dog's fury and the woman's steady aim, the men fled into the dark without the papers, though not without firing a single wild shot that splintered the tent pole a foot from where Copper stood his ground. It was the closest the dog had come to danger through the whole ordeal, and Eleanor's hands did not stop shaking until well past sunrise, though Copper himself seemed to have already forgotten the fright of it, tail wagging as he nosed at her sleeve, checking on her the way he always had, as though he were the one who needed comforting her, and not the other way around. She spent what remained of that night, sitting upright, with the rifle across her knees, and Copper's warm weight pressed the length of her side, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods, and thinking, of all things, of the auctioneer's laughter the day she'd bought this land. She wondered if word would ever reach him, and the rest of Larkspur, that the fool's purchase had very nearly cost 2 grown men their nerve in the dark, driven off by a widow and a dog neither of them had thought worth fearing. There was no triumph in the thought, not yet, only a kind of grim, tired clarity, the understanding that she had crossed some line in the last weeks from a woman merely surviving into a woman standing her ground, and that there would be no going back to the first version of herself now, whatever the hearing decided. The 2 remaining days passed in careful preparation. Eleanor rode into Larkspur, and sat with Judge Dunn's clerk to have the surviving documents properly copied and witnessed, so that no single loss or theft could undo what Copper had already uncovered. She spoke too, with 3 of the river ranchers directly, quiet conversations held over fence rails and kitchen tables, laying out plainly what she believed the old grant meant, and what she intended to do with it, if the judge ruled in her favor. Not conquest, but rather the kind of quiet fairness Thomas himself had always believed the land owed to the people who worked it honestly. Some of those ranchers had laughed at her too, back at the auction. None of them laughed now. They listened, and nodded, and one older woman, a widow herself, reached across the table and gripped Eleanor's hand hard enough to bruise, and said only, "Good. It's about time someone made that man answer for something." The hearing itself, when it finally came, filled the little Larkspur courthouse to its walls. Half the county turned out to watch the widow who'd bought worthless rock stand across from the man who owned the bank. Eleanor laid out the journal, the grant documents, the notarized water rights, and the county surveyor, a cautious, precise man with no love for Pruitt and less patience for his tactics, confirmed what the old papers claimed. The original grant boundaries matched, beyond reasonable dispute, the very stretch of river Pruitt had spent over a decade maneuvering to control. Pruitt's lawyer argued age, argued abandonment, argued that 90 years of silence should void any claim regardless of its legal merit, and for a long cold moment, it seemed the argument might carry the room. But Judge Dunn, weighing law that favored no man simply for being patient in his greed, ruled that a grant once made and never formally revoked, remained a grant, however long forgotten, and that Eleanor Hargrove, as current holder of the original documents and owner of the land on which they'd been found, held rightful claim to the water access they described. It was, in the plainest terms the county had ever seen, a karmic restoration nobody in Larkspur would forget for a generation. Pruitt's carefully assembled debts collapsed almost overnight once the ranchers who owed him understood the water they depended on no longer answered to his terms. Several notes were quietly renegotiated once the bank's board, embarrassed and exposed, moved to distance themselves from a man whose schemes had finally cost the institution more in reputation than his water deals had ever earned it. Word of the hearing traveled well beyond Larkspur before the month was out, and with it traveled the particular, satisfying detail that undid Pruitt more than any single ruling could have. The whole county now knew he had spent 10 quiet years trying to buy the very parcel he'd once dismissed, in public, as worthless. A man can survive losing a legal argument. It is harder to survive being laughed at by the same people he once laughed at first, and Larkspur, having waited a long while for the chance, did not deny itself the satisfaction. Pruitt himself, stripped of the leverage that had built his fortune, sold off half his holdings within the year, and left the county altogether. A quiet, unceremonious end, for a man who'd spent a decade making certain everyone else's endings were neither. And Eleanor did not seize the water rights for herself alone, though she would have been within her rights to. She brought the ranchers together, the same men and women who'd once laughed at her auction and later depended on her water, and she structured an agreement, plain and fair, that gave every family along the river a stake in what her dog had dug up from 90 years of dust, access shared, not hoarded, in memory of a husband who'd believed the land west of Larkspur was worth something to somebody, and in honor of the dog who'd trusted his nose over the whole town's opinion of a fool. The gold from Kerr's strongbox, once appraised and sold, was enough to rebuild the house with the stone chimney, and enough left over to see the county through a hard winter without a single family going under. Eleanor kept one coin for herself, a single 1821 piece she wore on a chain Thomas would have recognized as exactly her sort of quiet stubbornness, and she kept Widow's Table too, though nobody in the county called it that anymore. And every evening, when the light went long and gold across the red rock, Copper still trotted out to that western rise from habit, more than need now, and sat, and looked back at the woman who'd trusted him, when trusting anything at all had felt like more than she had left to give. So tonight we leave you with the question Eleanor herself must have turned over more than once, out there under the wide frontier sky. If you found a hidden piece of history buried on land everyone else called worthless, would you keep it for yourself, or would you share it, the way she did, and let it change more lives than just your own? Tell us in the comments what an overlooked place has taught you about what real value looks like. Until next time, stay close.